What if I told you that the city of Berlin at the end of World War II was actually surrendered 6 days before the entire country was? This is the short story of Defense and Wehrmacht General Helmuth Weidling. And here's how this all went down. Weidling had been part of the Wehrmacht for many, many years, and all the way back to when, I believe World War I. But he was a general in the Wehrmacht throughout all of World War II. And his career really began when he was part of the Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of the Soviet Union. This will come into play later on. Now, where you get all the way to the Battle of Berlin in the middle of 1945, and the General Weidling had in mid-April of 1945, a report had reached Hitler that Weidling had retreated his army unit from Berlin. Now, this had come on April 22nd of 1945, and he ordered Weidling executed. But it later came back to Hitler that this was false information. Weidling had not retreated. In fact, he had advanced. And so, in kind of a Nazi version of pie in the face, Hitler reversed the execution on April 22nd. Then on the next day, April 23rd of 1945, he put Weidling in charge of the defense of Berlin. Now, Weidling was a very, very excellent defensive tactician, which is probably why he didn't do so well in Operation Barbarossa when the Germans were on the offensive. But his excellence in defensive warfare. And first thing that he did when he took over the post was to set up his shop, his headquarters in Bündnerstrasse, which is a very short distance from the Führer bunker. Next thing he did was set up the defense of Berlin into 8 sectors. And these 8 sectors would have their own field generals in charge of the defense. Now, by this point, the manpower and resources available to Weidling were very limited. You're talking about maybe 40,000 actual traditional Wehrmacht soldiers, and about the same number of Hitler Youth, and a similar number of what are called the Volkssturm, which is a civilian militia that was created by Hitler out of men who were not able to qualify for combat, and also old retired veterans of, say, World War I, who were too old for combat duty. So you've got this ragtag group of about 120,000 defenders available to Weidling. The number of Russians that had approached and were about to reach Berlin, number is somewhere around 2 million. Now, Weidling had set up, again, a master of defensive warfare. And what would become the rubble of Berlin after the Allies had bombed the bejeebers out of it was very conducive to defensive warfare. You have destroyed buildings, obstacles galore. It's a death fiesta of an obstacle course that was available to him. And so he used it and had preparations. He utilized civilians to prepare for this defense against this raging horde of Soviet anger and simply men who were hell-bent on revenge. And as such, he had set up this defense. And initially it had worked fairly well. But of course, when you're up against 2 million plus Red Army soldiers, it's not going to hold for very long. The realization that this was not going to hold for very long, Weidling had taken over this defense on April 23rd. On April 30th, Hitler, of course, offed himself in the Fuhrer bunker. And Weidling, being a short walk from the Fuhrer bunker, walked from his headquarters over on May 1st and was informed by Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann that Hitler had taken himself out of the war at the hands of his pistol. And Weidling quietly went back to his headquarters and just did a rough mental calculation in his head. He came to the realization that his defense was absolutely completely and utterly impossible. The Russians were going to take the city. It was just a question of how fast. And so Helmuth Weidling woke up on May 2nd and just said, the gig is up. We are not going to be able to defend the city at all. And so he handwrote a letter on May 2nd that was shared with both Russian General Zhukov and also his own soldiers. And he determined at this time that the gig was up. Any continued fighting was going to result in the loss of tens of thousands of men, children, and civilians. And there was just no sense carrying on. By this point, of course, Hitler was gone. Hitler, the one who had demanded no retreat, no surrender, not giving an inch back, was no longer an obstacle. Of course, they told Weidling this on condition that he'd not tell anybody else, with the exception of one man. And the only man that he was allowed to inform of this situation was Joseph Stalin. Now, when it came to General Zhukov, he kind of expressed it in code. This is not a very stupid man by any means. He could couch words such that he was able to explain to them that Hitler was no longer in the picture. And so he wrote this letter to General Zhukov, the rest of the Red Army leadership, and his own soldiers. Basically expressed that, if I were to order you to continue fighting, this is going to result in the loss of many, many of you in a battle that can't be won. We can't even inflict minor damage on the Soviets at this point. So you are hereby ordered to lay down your arms and basically stop fighting immediately upon receipt and reading of this letter. So the wind down of operations in Berlin was not sudden. It was at whatever rate and time that his soldiers received this letter of a single-handedly ordered ceasefire. The Russians were under no such orders, but they kind of were, because Zhukov had expressed to his armies that the Germans were laying down arms. And so the Red Army knew, and so they also mutually ceased fire. And the Germans had, of course, also obviously ceased fire. In doing so, General Weidling likely saved tens and thousands of lives, if not hundreds and thousands of lives. And when you talk about adding civilian counts, Berlin holding 3 million residents at the time. And so he would never have called himself a hero, but he inadvertently became one. He did not do this as a matter of heroic action. It was a practicality. He was not going to make his men, inflict tens of thousands of fatalities for a cause that could not be won. Now notice the date. It's May 2nd, 1945. You read in your history books in that VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, was actually May 8th of 1945. Now, what's the difference on this? Well, the difference is that the surrender of Berlin was not equal to the surrender of Nazi Germany and the Wehrmacht. That was conducted by General Alfred Jodl, who was basically a field marshal of the highest rank within the German Wehrmacht, or the German army, as it were. So the surrender of the entire nation's army didn't occur until 6 days later, also in Berlin, though. And it was done in May 8th of 1945. This is when the Russians realized, also on the heels of Hitler removing himself, realizing that they couldn't win either. Now, after that surrender, of course, as I've explained before, a rump government of Nazi Germany continued to exist about 100 miles north of Berlin in the city of Flensburg, led by Hitler's appointee or appointed successor in his final will and testament from before he executed himself on April 29th, or April 30th of 1945. But Jodl was part of that rump government. And for a few days after Hitler's suicide, and of course, Dönitz had taken over what little remained of the government. It didn't really govern, but Jodl was part of the inner circle. And therefore, because he was part of Dönitz's inner circle, he was seen as having the authority to conduct a surrender. So it probably took several extra days just to reach this point, just to even get to the point where they could determine who could execute a surrender. But indeed, it wound up being Alfred Jodl who did execute this 6 days after Weidling's surrender of the Berlin defense. And so this was a chaotic time. Orders were going out that nobody knew who had the power to issue them. Orders were going out not even knowing who issued them. And so this is why you have a difference of 6 days between initially the surrender of Berlin and the surrender of Nazi Germany as a whole. 6 days of chaos between May 2nd and May 8th of 1945. So there you have it. A hero who was not really a hero. In case you were really wondering what happened to Weidling after the war, when he surrendered, he was taken into Soviet custody, and he was never freed from captivity. He actually died in Soviet captivity in 1956, ostensibly of a heart attack. Given his age at the time being 64, it's likely that's the truth, but on the same token, who knows? But him passing away in 1956 meant that he actually outlived Joseph Stalin by 3 years. Weidling was later, and remains to this day, considered non-rehabilitation eligible by the Russian Federation because of the crimes that his armies committed, going back to that Operation Barbarossa invasion in 1941, going back to that invasion, the crimes that his men committed in that invasion, and of course those were legion. I could do another entire episode entirely based on that alone. But anyway, the Soviets were not, they determined him not rehabilitatable. And that's the status that he remains in to this day. So there is General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense, who surrendered his defense 6 days before the nation's defense. So there's the story, guys. And it's very fitting that I'm filming this on Veterans Day. And our own men sacrificed tremendously to save really the humanity in that battle of that very battle of Berlin, and also throughout points west where where us Americans were stationed, and we were part of that landing in Normandy a year prior. So happy Veterans Day. And if you're watching this and if you're wondering if I'm filming this while I'm at work, well, guess what? I'm not. Because it's Veterans Day. It's a bank holiday in the United States. So I'm not spending work time on this one today. But I do value this time. And I just wish everybody a happy Veterans Day. And just remember those who sacrificed, who made the ultimate sacrifice, which would be on Memorial Day. But you can also commemorate them on Veterans Day, and the men who gave up their lives and threw everything aside to save our freedoms and that of the rest of the world in 1945. There you have it, guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Peace out, homies.